Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Ask the Expert series. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. For today's live question and answer topic, we'll be discussing the Performance Evaluation Report. We're lucky enough today to have two presenters. Our first presenter is our president, Laurie Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Laurie has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety, and pharmacovigilance management and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Laurie is a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. And joining us today also is Dr. Sarah Chavez, a principal medical writer with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for the past 15 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Laurie.
Hey everyone, thank you, Olivia. Thanks for joining everyone today. And I'm really excited that Sarah Chavez, our Chief IVDR expert within Criterion Edge, has had the time and agreed to join us today to help answer your questions. So today we're going to field questions on how to align your internal processes and systems to comply with those rigorous IVDR regulations. We're going to talk a little bit about planning and development stages of the performance evaluation report. I'm sure you have a lot of questions about that. And then the technical documents, or in general, what is required in the performance evaluation report. And often we also get questions about not just the PER itself, but the PEP, PMPF plans, and so forth. So we're looking forward to all of your questions. We may not be able to answer all of them in as completely as we would like, because so much of the IVDR learning is evolving as we speak. Certainly the IVDR has been written, but just like, I'll just say for a moment that just like in MDR, when we first started writing, CERs in 2016, moving into 2017 when MedDev 2.7 Rev 4 came out, and then the MDR, those initial MDR requirements started coming out in 2017 and 18. And things morphed and changed from those early days. A CER that was written in 2018 looks much different than a CER written in 2021. And we suspect, and Sarah and I suspect, that it will be the same sort of evolution that we'll see in the IVD industry as well. We evolve and grow as our reports and that we send to the notified bodies are pressure tested under notified body review. And then the notified bodies are beginning to learn more, and their learning becomes more focused and feedback becomes more focused back to the sponsor companies. So this is a loop that we're all a part of, and we're all in it together.
And with that, let's get to our first question. Laurie and Sarah, let me know when you can see the question on your screen.
We can. Sarah, can you see?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Our first question today is, what are the changes in an IVDR to be considered for reevaluating its performance evaluation?
What are the changes in an IVD to be considered for reevaluating its performance evaluation? Sarah, do you have any thoughts on what that question might be getting at?
I think it's kind of getting at basically what are going to be the differences compared to what we've been doing up until this point. And for a lot of devices, you may already have like FDA clearance or some other type of requirements that you've conducted up until this point. I think the main difference here is that you're going to be expected to produce and analyze a lot more data and have a lot more of your processes written out and sort of streamlined. So having that performance evaluation plan and the standard operating procedure and sort of a process by which you're going to continue to evaluate data in a reproducible way. I think that's going to be the main challenge for most folks who are going to be new to this level of regulation.
All right, great. Thank you, Sarah. Here's our next question. Can you provide the best approach to PER reports?
Well, I'll take that. To provide the best approach to PER reports will be, I would start with something that might be very straightforward, which is allow yourself enough time. If you think a PER will take you 2 months, 3 months to write, you should probably double that, especially here in the very early stages where there's so much learning still to be done, documents to gather for the first time, processes to put into place for the first time. So I would say, first of all, provide you and your team enough time to do it. Secondly, then, we know that the PER is unique from the CER, because in the medical device world, there are no feeder documents, as if you have the same kind of feeder documents, I should say, that you have in the IVD space. The IVD space and IVDR is also calling out unique reports that the medical device space doesn't need to prepare. And those unique reports are the scientific validity report, the clinical performance report, and the analytical performance report. And those are unique to your industry. So be sure you get those, give yourself enough time to get those foundational reports done before you pivot to the PER. The PER takes in so much more information. It loops all of this information together to evaluate the safety and performance of your device as it relates to the state of the art. And the biggest piece of that, besides the state of the art, the scientific validity, the clinical literature, and all your clinical data sources, is going to be that, and all that analysis is that end piece in the PER, which is about your risk and benefit. And there may be some questions coming up about risk and benefit, but that is a major piece of the PER. It's where everything, just like in the CER world, it's where everything sort of comes together. So again, prepare your internal documentation, get them ready. Don't be revving your IFU when you're trying to write a PER. That's a recipe for delay. So that's some of my quick hints.
Great, thank you. Let's get to our next question. How do you gather clinical data for an IVD software?
So I can try to take this one. This can be challenging because I know for many of you, you've never been required to do this type of level of reporting. The main thing is to know that you're still going to be expected to present the different components that any other IVD would be expected to include. So you're still going to want to explain what is classified as state of the art, what are the risks and the benefits associated with your particular software. So it's first and foremost, the software is being classified as a medical device. So you have to know your intended purpose, whether you're doing genetic testing or some sort of like a companion diagnostic testing, or if you're a standalone software. You have to be clear on what your actual intended purpose is. And then you want to make sure that you really understand sort of how you fall in terms of your classification level. So there are some guidances in the IVDR annex that will help you determine sort of your class, whether you're a class B or a class C, or in some cases class D. It's going to fall in line with sort of what is the risk of associated with returning a false positive or a false negative. What would that mean in terms of risk to the patients? So a lot of the same things the same approach that we would take as if you were the actual IVD would still apply if you were the software used to analyze or detect a particular assay or a particular analyte. You're still going to want to explain what your analyte is and still take a fairly similar approach as you were if you were the actual like analyte itself or an antibody designed to detect a particular analyte. The software to detect that analyte is just as important.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Here's our next question. What are the biggest pitfalls with regard to writing the PER?
Well, I can start with that. Sarah, you can certainly chime in. Sarah has written these documents before, and she has a very unique writer's perspective. But I would start by saying the first pitfall that I always say, because this is a drum that I bang all the time, which is which is time. Time is the biggest pitfall. If you're unprepared and you haven't given yourself enough time to adjust, pivot, tackle unexpected roadblocks during this process, and your notified body is waiting for that submission on, August the 1st of next year, and here it is, middle of June, and you're still dealing with rate limiting steps, it becomes a problem. So I would say time is the biggest pitfall. And Sarah, I'll let you jump in on this thought, underestimating how difficult this process is. Would you like to expand on that at all, Sarah, this underestimation of really how much this takes?
Definitely. I think the major challenge that I've seen folks who are new to this whole process, as they're trying to understand it, it's coming up with the idea of what we mean by these systematic literature reviews and what information goes into each of the different components, because you have these 3 standalone feeder documents, but the goal of the PER is to kind of meld them all together to tell a complete story. You want them each to be able to stand alone and to be a cohesive final report. You'll have your analytical performance report, but how much overlap will you have between your APR and your CPR or your SPR? And that's really where that state of the art comes in. The state of the art is going to be in that SVR. It's going to set the backdrop. It's going to tell you what your analyte is, what's the purpose of it, and it's going to also explain any alternatives and really sort of lay the groundwork that gives you enough background to really understand the sort of the rationale behind the other feeder documents. So I found that trying to identify sort of how to collect the information to develop that systematic approach to that state-of-the-art section is really one of the areas that the most folks are struggling with.
All right, thanks. Let's get to our next question. How far back do studies need to go for the PER?
Well, this is a question that comes up both in the MDR world, and it certainly will be a question that our IVD colleagues will be addressing as well. This is that sort of existential question about what are we supposed to do, about how far are we supposed to go back on our literature searches to capture data, both on the subject device and on the competitor device. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and Sarah will certainly chime in, I think, with her thoughts as well. But from our learning in the MDR space, and this is one thing that has evolved over the year, those early years until now. Early in the MDR space, the notified bodies didn't seem to express a big opinion about how far back your time range should go for looking for clinical literature on your device. on your subject device itself. Some of our clients thought we should go back 10 years. Some of our clients thought we should go back until the dawn of time, like when the device was first approved. And others really didn't have an opinion and didn't know. It turns out that that's evolved. Certainly, you do not need to go back to the dawn of time when your device was first approved. What it seems to be settling into the MDR world right now is a 5-year look back, a 3-year look back, really nothing more than that for subject device and competitor device articles. So Sarah, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, the main thing I've noticed is that if it's a device that's very widely used and you don't expect to get a lot of brand new studies that are going to have those safety and performance objectives sort of clearly stated, it may be helpful to, as part of your state-of-the-art search, you'll retrieve some meta-analyses that do go back and they'll say over the past 10 years, here's sort of what the literature and sort of the trends that we've seen in terms of the safety and performance. So it's not that you're not going to explain any of the historic studies, or if there is something that's was a pivotal study, you can certainly mention that. But in terms of actually developing your criteria by which you're going to sort of establish the state of the art, you want to make sure that that's the most recent studies that are available. So that's where that 5-year mark is really helpful. You don't necessarily want to try to compare people who are doing the assay right now to people who did that same assay 20 years ago, because so many things have changed between now and then. So you're going to compare and develop these ranges based on the most recent data, but that's not to say that you're going to exclude any mention of studies done prior to the past 5 years.
Yeah, and Sarah, I'm going to jump back in and explain a little bit further about what you meant by the criteria, just for those on the call that may still be wrapping their minds around safety and performance objectives and acceptance criteria. So let's pause for a moment to what Sarah was referring to were the acceptance criteria derived from competitor data and pulling those ranges on the predetermined safety and performance objectives. So in the state of the art section, or the SVR of your, the SVR or the state of the art section of your PER, you will tell the state of the art story of your device, starting from epidemiology and kind of the beginning of time, the clinical conditions, moving all the way through therapeutic options or type of testing options, all the way through down to where you are right now with the maturity of technology of your device or analyte. And then that's where you're telling the story of where your device sits in comparison to its peers, if you will, its competitors. And then the last thing you'll do in the SVR, the state of the art section, is you will do a competitor device search, not your subject device, but a competitor device search. And you will, and let's just say, as we said, that's a 5-year search. You've identified 6 main competitors of your analyte or device. And what we would do then, our team will run that search and screen the results and extract the acceptance criteria data. In other words, the results, the ranges of your competitors in those same safety and performance objectives. Time to this or accuracy of that, whatever your S&P objectives are, we're going to extract those data results from your competitor device, your competitor search, and those ranges create the bar by which your subject device data in those same safety and performance objectives will be compared back against. So that was a long explanation, but I wanted to make sure that people knew that there's safety and performance objectives, there's acceptance criteria. These are all new concepts And so if you have any further questions on that or would like to find out more, just contact us or let us know or put your question up, because this is a complex part and nuance of all of these reports, the safety and performance. So thank you.
I think that was a great answer, Laurie. And we also have a recent webinar that we can share in the chat for more explanation on the safety and performance measures. So we'll share that. And let's get to our next question. Is literature search and appraisal the only mandatory route for proving clinical performance and scientific validity?
Sarah, do you want to talk about other sources of data?
You can include
research. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you can include some internal, like let's say you have a particular device in which there isn't a lot of published literature. You're certainly going to have some internal reports and documentation and some of those analytical performance reports. So you can definitely draw from those. There may also be, as part of the scientific validity, you're going to pull from published literature on close competitors. So while your particular IVD may not have any clinical data out there, you can identify who is your closest competitor or something that is very similar to yours and identify the data from those close competitors and use that to help supplement as well. So yeah, you may have to, if there's a limited publication profile for your particular IVD, you may have to go a little bit outside and identify other sources. You're still going to be expected to present a solid case for the clinical performance of your particular IVD.
I'd like to jump in here and say that what we're really talking about, and Sarah, correct me if you have a different opinion, but what we haven't talked a lot about in these webinars is the notion of equivalence, have we?
No, not much.
We haven't really, and let's just introduce what the concept of equivalence is in the MDR space. And it honestly remains to be seen how this is going to be handled in the IVD space. Equivalence means this. And so first of all, this question has to do with kind of hints around the edges of, do I have enough clinical data to establish the safety and performance of my device? Do I have enough? How much is enough? This kind of existential question that comes up all the time. How much data is enough to establish the safety and performance of my device? And this question sort of hints around the edges of that. So if I look in the literature on my own device or manufacturer held data, which is what Sarah talked about, your own internal data on, maybe you conducted clinical investigations, maybe not. Maybe you already have some PMS data, that's safety data. So you have some sources of manufacturer held data, but what if you feel like it's not enough to establish safety and performance? What do they do in the medical device space? They pull in an equivalent device. An equivalent device is not a competitor device. It cannot be a competitor device. It must be a predicate device in which you own basically the tech file on that. You cannot. So that's a hard and fast rule. You have to have access to present an equivalent device within your PER. So let's just say device X is your PER. Device X is your own device, and it has a big tech file, and you have years of data on it. And now device Y has come along. Maybe it's a offshoot of device X. It's very similar to it. It has a few bells and whistles that are a little different. The second device, device Y, has very little data. So ideally, equivalence can be established between device X, which you own, and device Y, and has plenty of data, and device Y, which you own, that has very little data. And then that becomes a logic problem, which is if A equals B, and B equals C, then A equals C. It's a loop. The data for the first device, if you establish equivalence between the two, that they are identical in every clinical, technical, and biological aspect that's important, or that the changes do not have a clinical impact, if you can justify all of that, then those two devices become equivalent. They are the same. And the data for one supports the data for the other. And then so this is an equivalence argument that is used fairly commonly in the medical device space. So it will remain to be seen. I'm not going to pretend to say that we've written a PER that has equivalence in it. So we're like you. We're wondering if this is going to be something that's going to become, that's going to be acceptable in the PER, the notion of equivalence.
All right, thank you, ladies. Here is our next question. What aspects of the APR are included in the PER?
Sarah, you want to take that?
So this is going to be where you're really going to explain a lot of sort of the tech files that you've got, some of the quality control files that we all have for any particular test that you've run. You know, you're going to check how reproducible your assay is. You're going to have a lot of replicates. You're going to look at sort of the predictive values associated with your particular analyte and whatever clinical condition you're diagnosing. And then also look at just sort of anything that could affect that reproducibility, whether it's temperature or pH or sample preparations or anything along those lines. So each one of those aspects of the APR will go into detail and provide all of the precise data necessary to support sensitivity, specificity, repeatability, all of those. But the PER will also include discussions within your state of the art that explains kind of what is the rationale, why is that relevant, why is that important for the overall IVD itself. So you're going to want to explain why having a certain level of sensitivity, how does that correlate with the clinical guidelines for diagnosing a particular condition? Do you need to have a certain, like if one assay has a sensitivity of 90% compared to another assay is only 70% sensitive, that's going to be something that you're going to want to explain, that sort of how does your particular type of IVD compare to other alternative diagnostic tools that are out there. So you're going to link it together and make sure that parts of the state of the art complement the aspects that you go into detail about in the APR. So it's definitely going to be a critical component within the PER, because that's where you're going to actually show the data that supports the ranges that you established for your particular IVD. But the state of the art is going to be where you're going to show how other similar competitor devices, what their particular sensitivity and specificities are, so that then you'll be able to make that comparison between your IVD and the competitive landscape.
That was an excellent answer, Sarah. Thank you. That was actually very well explained. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, we'll get to our next question. What's the difference between intended benefits, anticipated risks, and primary outcomes in terms of comparison of one's device?
What's the difference between intended benefits, anticipated risks, and the outcomes in terms of comparison of one's device? I don't think I understand Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this question?
I think it's kind of getting at, there are going to be sections within the a typical state-of-the-art section where you would explain benefits and risks. And the way I usually think about that is more in terms of sort of the clinical benefits and the clinical risks. So what are, from a patient's perspective, what are the benefits and risks of using this particular diagnostic tool to make a diagnosis? Is there a significant risk of, in terms of the diagnostic like accuracy? Do you have a higher risk of a false positive associated with this that could necessitate you going in for further follow-up tests unnecessarily? Are there any benefits in terms of maybe your analyte is far more sensitive than another type of analyte? So it may reduce the amount, or maybe it's something where based on your sensitivity levels, you need a smaller amount of sample overall. So if you're talking about a biopsy sample, smaller sample size is definitely a benefit. So I usually think of benefits and risks more or less in terms of the patient's perspective, whereas the primary outcomes are how you're actually determining and measuring your IVD compared to your competitors. So those are going to be the actual sensitivity, specificity, anything that's a measurable outcome that you've established as one of your safety or performance criteria that you're going to use to set that landscape.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Our next question may be familiar to you, Laura and Sarah, and that is, how is the state of the art important in a PER?
Well, I'll start, but I can also tell you that Sarah is also our champ state-of-the-art specialty writer. She has written state-of-the-art sections. At Criterion Edge, we are a team of writers. We have a large team that are assigned to sometimes different parts of documents. And for the state-of-the-art section of a CER, and it will be the same for a PER. That's a very standalone, almost a standalone type of section. In other words, Sarah can be writing a state-of-the-art section while other members of the writing team are preparing device description, doing systematic literature reviews, and so forth. But that state-of-the-art section is almost a story unto itself, and it's housed, within its own section where it has sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end. It all tells a story from start to finish. So it is. And I will say, and I've said this anytime I have a chance, I will say, in our opinion at Criterion Edge, the state-of-the-art section is the foundational and perhaps the most important part of a CER, and it will be the same for a PER. So that's why in the IVD space, the notified bodies the regulators have created this document called the Scientific Validity Report, which is very roughly equivalent to a state-of-the-art section in a CER, and it will be very equivalent to the state-of-the-art section in a PER, where you establish the state of the art of your device within its own landscape. It's a landscape analysis of its competitors that work very similarly to it, and what then, through those acceptance criteria from safety and performance objectives, what then is the bar that needs to be that has established the performance and the safety, state-of-the-art performance and safety within that milieu, within that competitive landscape. And so it is the foundational section of a PER. Sarah, do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm probably a little biased, but it's coming from the sort of being in a lab environment for so long. I kind of think of this more or less as like the approach you would take for a meta-analysis or a systematic literature review if you were writing about your particular research area. It's going to be really important to set up the entire background and the entire landscape of where your particular analyte or where your particular type of test or class of tests falls within the entire landscape. And here's where you're going to also present those acceptability criteria that we talked about. So if you have not properly selected the appropriate criteria to judge yourself by compared to other competitors, you may not get a lot of data that's being reported. If you have selected a particular way of measuring success or failure of your assay that literally no one else uses, there's not going to be much data out there that you can compare yourself to. So identifying how am I going to compare myself to the competitive landscape? What do I consider to be a competitor versus an alternative? what do the clinical guidelines state about how diagnoses should be conducted, and then understanding truly those sort of what is your IFU telling you, like, are there certain patients who can use your IVD and are there certain ones who should not use your particular test for diagnostic purposes? All of those things have to get presented in the state of the art so that eliminates any questions from the reviewers later on about when and where and why your particular IVD is considered state of the art.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to remind everyone here today that if you're looking for more information on this topic, you can schedule a free 30-minute consult with us, and the link to schedule that will be in the chat. Here's our next question. Is it considered best practice to include the benefit risk statement in the PER?
Well, I'll say that's a yes/no question, and so I would say yes, it is, but it can be expanded upon greatly. I'm not sure what they mean by the benefit risk statement. The risk benefit section of a PER is, and I think I did my opening remarks saying that was also a critical section of the, will be a critical section of the PER, because the notified bodies are looking for that, they're looking for relevance at the end of the day. In other words, the performance evaluation report is a report on the company's performance evaluation process of the subject device for that particular PER. So it's a process that they're reporting on from beginning to end. Okay, so you've reported on the process, excuse me, you've done your clinical literature reviews, you've reported all of your data, you've analyzed all those data, you've weighted and appraised the data sets, and you've established your acceptability criteria and your safety and performance objectives. Great. So what? Because the remaining question at the end answers the so what question, which is, what are you going to do with this information? How is it going to loop back into your own risk benefit management system internally, so that IFUs can be updated, learnings can be applied, adjustments can be made, that there's assurance that the device is still safe and efficacious and performs as intended in the IFU. So it's all about the risk benefit section of the PER, where all of that performance evaluation report comes together to tell the notified body, what are you going to do with all of this? What did you just learn? And what's going to loop back into your quality management system? Sarah, do you have anything further to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much what I was going to say. This is going to be a critical sort of bridge between your performance evaluation plan and your PER. You're reporting about what you identified in this specific evaluation of the current state of the benefits and risks, but the PEP will also help you identify best practice to continue to assess this throughout the life of your particular IVD. As you start to identify new particular benefits or risks, that's going to be reflected within the updates to the PER. So having that be well thought out and tied in to your safety and performance requirements is going to be really helpful for just keeping you organized and preparing for the updates after this first round.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Here's our next question. What is the level of detail in the PER versus the APR, CPR, and SVR?
Well, I think specifically this question says the level of detail that's needed in the PER versus as compared to just referring to the APR, the CPR, and the SVR, those external feeder documents. I'm gonna interpret the question that way, because we have gotten this question before. Gosh, we've already written, or we're going to write, an APR, a CPR, and an SVR. Why can't we just write the PER and get to that section and say, see document 123 XYZ, which is the APR, and don't say anything more about it? If that is, Sarah, do you interpret that that might be what this question is really asking?
Yeah, I think so. I'm kind of picturing it as, do I just say, see this document, or do I staple it in and just copy it verbatim, or do I do something in between?
Right. So I agree. Definitely, it does. You don't get to say in a PER, because you certainly don't get to do it in a CER. The notified bodies, let me just say something global. The notified bodies want to sit down with this report, and it will be the same for the PER as it is for the CER. They want to sit down and they want to read the story from beginning to end. Now, they recognize that for further information or further detail, if they have questions, that's why you cross-reference all of your documentation throughout your PER. But you have to still present it, explain it, and integrate it into your story, the information. You don't just get to say, go read this if you want to know more about, our clinical performance of our device. You basically don't get to do that. So, but Sarah just alluded to, do I just copy and paste the SVR in from beginning to end and plunk it right into the PER? Is it good to go? Sarah, I kind of think that depends. My spidey sense is that's not going to be good enough.
I feel like it's going to be like if you're writing your graduate thesis and you just say, well, I did this paper, this paper, this paper, done, and leave it at that. If you don't have some sort of an overarching, like a scaffold by which you can sort of transition between those two independent report or three independent reports, it's going to feel very disjointed. And it could get confusing. And if they have to really think and dig and try to find this information, they're going to come back to you with questions. So if you think about the PER as your chance to kind of draw all three of these reports together and show the continuity between them, that's where having a template and having a template that you trust is really going to be your best friend. You want to make sure that you're clear on how to develop these independent reports and what templates you'll use for those, but then also have a strategy that you can then use to put that information into the PER without just doing a copy paste.
All right, we're reaching the end of our session, so we have time for just one more question. Here it is. How do we demonstrate a device has sufficient clinical evidence to confirm its performance and safety?
The existential question, isn't it, Sarah?
Yeah.
Well, it's not really, I mean, how do we demonstrate? The verb that's used there is how do we demonstrate it? So you have to present all of your available technical, clinical, published data, manufacturer held data, everything has to be presented rigorously, analyzed rigorously, weighted and appraised. Those data sets must all be weighted and appraised and compared back to those acceptance criteria of your safety and performance objectives. So Sarah alluded to one thing that was really important a few minutes ago, which was choose your safety and performance objectives wisely. It does not, this is not, does not have to be 10 safety objectives and 10 performance objectives. Sometimes it's really just one or two of each. So pick the critical safety and performance objectives relevant to your IVD, relevant to your internal documentation systems, relevant to your PMS data, relevant to the clinical benefits and risks and the IFUs. In other words, don't pick safety and performance objectives that are esoteric or vague or not quantitative, because then they won't match the data that you do hold and the data that is then out in the published literature. So first of all, choose those objectives wisely. They have to be rigorous enough and important enough to be, keystone type of, supporting safety and performance objectives for your device. They can't be so secondary that they don't really matter, but at the same time, they can't be so vague or so specific to your device that there's literally no data out there at all to be gathered. Nobody is collecting data on that on your device in the published literature. So choose wisely. And I'll let Sarah jump in here on this last question, but the other question then is the one that I wish we had a crystal ball on. How much data is enough? We have written many CERs, many 100 plus, and many of those MDR. We haven't really ever experienced a time that the notified body has come back and said, this is not enough data. But that's because internally, the teams are scrubbing through and making strategic and strong choices about combining devices, that equivalence argument that I talked about earlier, where the data for one supports the other device if they're equivalent, even though the other device doesn't have much data. That's a strategy. And then there's the strategy of really choosing your safety and performance objectives carefully so that you can make a strong argument. And at the end of the day, the notified body will either accept or have questions about your data presentation. And that's okay. There are always questions from the notified body. I can disabuse you of that right now. 100% of the time, the notified body will come back with clarifying questions. They always do. Even in the strongest of CERs, for example, they will come back and ask for clarification or additional information. It's usually not a big scary thing. It's not because they doubt it. It's just that they just want a little bit more information. So Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this as we wind up for today?
Well, it kind of ties back to the state of the art section again, too, because there's going to be a section within there where you're going to justify your choice of performance and safety objectives and try to explain how they tie into what's recommended by clinical organizations or current best practice guidelines. So you will be expected as part of the state of the art to directly explain why you've selected these particular objectives. So having that state of the art and working on that early in the process, I think will help you make sure that you are clear on what those objectives are and that they're well thought out and that they match that they're in alignment with what is reported within clinical guidelines. I think that's where starting with the state of the art and then revisiting the state of the art as you're also preparing all these other feeder documents, there has to be that coordination aspect to it.
Thank you, Laurie and Sarah. That's all the time we have for today. I hope we were able to answer most of your questions, but if we didn't, please send us any other questions you have to consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you again, Laurie and Sarah, and everyone for all your great questions. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.